Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and thank you for listening to the YFP Podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week, I welcome Dr. Christina Fontana, creator of the Pharmacist Coach. We talk about her career journey into pharmacy, her trauma experience growing up in an abusive household, and how that shaped who she is today, and her entrepreneurial journey focused on empowering others to transform their lives, reveal their inner radiance, and step into more energy, confidence, and power. We then wrap up the show by discussing strategies for getting in the right mindset to set big goals for 2024. Let's hear a brief message from YFP team member Justin Woods, and then we'll jump into my interview with Dr. Christina Fontana.
This is Justin Woods from the YFP team with a quick message before the show. If you listen to the YFP podcast, you may learn something every now and then, either from Tim Albrecht, Tim Baker, or one of our guests. A lot of people listen to the show, but they may not execute or implement the things they learn. As pharmacists, we know the impact of non-adherence on patient outcomes and their overall well-being. As a pharmacist myself and part of the YFP team, I talk with pharmacists every day who are confused about how to implement financial knowledge. Pharmacists share with me that they're treading water financially, maybe took a DIY approach, reached a plateau, and are confused about what to do next. Or those who worked for decades can see the light at the end of the tunnel and feel uncertain about how the next chapter will unfold. If that sounds like you, one, it is not uncommon to feel that way. And two, does it make sense for us to have a conversation to see if YFP planning can help you? Visit yfpplanning.com or follow the link in the show notes to find a time that works for your schedule.
Christina, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. We're here on a Monday morning and it's raining.
Well,
so bringing the sunshine.
It's a great way to start a Monday, especially when, as you mentioned, it's cloudy, it's rainy, it's cold, but you very much have the holiday spirit wearing your polar bear gear. I love that. And I know the energy you're going to bring to the show is going to lighten the mood that is being set by the outside weather. So I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to interview you. We're going to unpack your career journey. We'll talk about your entrepreneurial journey. And then I'm going to pick your brain about advice you would have for our community listening about how you think about goal setting, as well as how you coach others in goal setting as we get ready to turn the page on to 2024. So let's start with your career journey in pharmacy. What led you into the profession? Where did you go to pharmacy school? And what was some of the work that you did upon graduation?
Yeah, so my dad was a pharmacist. I'm from a family full of pharmacists. So my uncle, my aunt, my sister, my dad, we all went to St. John's University. And I grew up working in my dad's store back from when I was like 3 years old, sweeping the floors, helping people find, cards for their granddaughter, working the register. Really, I learned my people skills. My dad would always say, all right, go talk to that person. Go help that person, go sweep the floor. And I think that those early experiences really helped me to kind of plant those seeds of, number one, customer service. My dad he knew everybody's name. He knew like what every customer, what their kids' names were, what sports they were in. And I just would watch him in awe and be like, wow, he's just so... How do you know all this? And then he knew all the drugs too in the back. You're amazing. So I was both in awe of my father, but also extremely terrified of him because he was a strong Italian dad, very strict, very controlling. And I actually grew up, and I'm very open about this, with a lot of abuse. So physical, mental, emotional. I loved my dad and I still do to this day. And I see now that that was an experience that I went through to strengthen my character to be who I am today. And I've gone through a lot of healing through that. But like kind of back to what, back at the pharmacy. So there was all of that going on. So like, I loved him. I admired him. He taught me so much and he was so charismatic, intelligent. And so I absorbed all of that. I was like a sponge, from a very early age. And I knew in those interactions with people that were at the counter, that's really where I like loved talking to people and hearing about their stories or what they were doing for the day. I grew to love people. And I just knew in my heart, like I felt this this rush in my body whenever someone was like, oh my God, you really helped me. I was like, this is
Mm.
my purpose. And so from probably around 13, 14, I knew that I wanted to help people. And so in my mind, I was like, oh, pharmacy.
Mhm.
So the day that I got into pharmacy school, I feel like my whole world opened up. I was so excited. It was like this whole new adventure.
Mm.
And at the same time, there was this internal struggle that was happening within me. So I had an eating disorder in high school where, I was anorexic, put a lot of pressure on myself, highly perfectionistic. Does this sound familiar, pharmacist? Right.
Mhm.
And so my trauma showed up in my body as
Mhm.
an eating disorder, high levels of anxiety. I was a high performer, like
Mhm.
I did kick line dance, all these different things, all throughout my childhood, because that was what I thought I had to be
Mm.
in order to be loved by and accepted by my
Mhm.
family. And so I went through pharmacy school. My head was down. I actually developed a different eating disorder at that time. So it was night eating syndrome. That's a whole other story. But essentially what I learned was that going through my healing journey, my nervous system was so
Mm.
overloaded from all of that
Mhm.
trauma, the high performing, trying to be perfect, all of those things, that eventually it had to come out somewhere because I suppressed my
Sure.
emotions. And you and I could talk about this for hours.
Mhm.
But fast forward to kind of as I was going through pharmacy school, I was kind of struggling internally with all of this, my eating disorder, anxiety. It just got compounded
Mhm.
because it's so much pressure to be in pharmacy school to make sure that you're, making the most out of your social time and, the commute and all of the other things that come with being, in pharmacy school, the pressure. So eventually I got to the end of my career or my time at St. John's, and I started to look at all of these different opportunities, and I was really excited about pursuing a residency. And so I I told my family, and I knew they weren't going to be happy about it because again, my dad owned this
Right.
pharmacy and he had groomed me and helped me for years. And I just said, I'm like, I want to do this other path.
Mhm.
And when I said that, he was not happy because, again, I was a people pleaser. I did whatever my parents said. I was a good girl, all of that.
Mhm.
And so what he was saying back to me was like, you know, how could you do this to us? Like, you're betraying us. I helped you, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't care.
Mm.
For the first time in my life, I just felt it in my gut. And I think it was the dynamic too of probably somewhat of a toxic
Yeah.
environment that I was already in that pharmacy setting, combined with this drive that I had and this, again, I felt that feeling in my heart, like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And
Mhm.
so I always say to people, I know you have to use logic, of course, but also using your intuition, like what
Mhm.
feels aligned and right to me. That was probably the first time in my life that I actually let that voice be louder than the
Mhm.
fear of what are they going to say? I
Yeah.
have to be perfect, all of that. So I did. I wound up pursuing the residency and living in my parents' house with walking on eggshells and feeling like I couldn't really like tell them what was happening because I had to go to mid-year and I had to like
Mhm.
develop a CV for the first time and business cards and all of that. And I actually didn't get any of my top 5 choices because you have to pick 5 residencies that you want to match with. And I was like devastated and I
Mm.
didn't know what to do. So I was talking to one of my professors at St. John's one day, and she's like, oh, like, why don't you try through the scramble? There's a
Mhm.
King's Pharmacy in Brooklyn that I think I saw didn't match. So I was like, well, let's see if this goes. I went and interviewed and I got the call that I got this residency. But that was the beginning of the crumble of my life because that was when I got kicked out of my house. My parents
Mm.
pretty much disowned me, and all of my stuff was thrown out onto the lawn, hangers, clothes, everything that was my life from my childhood room where I was still living at home with them was literally purged onto the lawn. So all my neighbors were probably like, what is happening right now?
Mhm.
So I literally had to pick up the pieces of my life and start fresh. Like that was my rock bottom. At that time, I was taking anxiety medication. My life was so unworkable because I wasn't really speaking my truth. And all of these patterns, the people pleasing, the perfectionism, the unworthiness that I had, it all kind of culminated into this moment where I was like, I'm choosing this. I'm choosing this new path. I don't care how scary it is. And I remember looking up at the sky and I just was like, it's going to be okay. I just had this feeling in my heart that even though my life was a mess physically, everything was all over the lawn, and I wasn't even allowed back in the house. And I got fired from my dad's pharmacy that day. So it was like one thing after the other. And by the way, it was like April of right when I was about to graduate pharmacy school. And so I was about to start a residency. I had 2 months left of pharmacy school. I still had to take my board exams. I had no job. I had not much money in a bank account, and I was living out of my car. And in that moment, like I said, I was like, I can do this. I don't know if it was God, if it was the strength, something within me. I just knew that I had made the right decision. And there had been so much bullying and abuse. And I was like, I'm done with this. So anyway, fast forward, and tell me when I'm
This is good. I've got so many questions, but this is good. Finish your journey here. Yep.
So there's so much more, that was the beginning of my entrepreneurial journey, really was getting into that residency, because it really opened up my eyes to all of the different possibilities within pharmacy. And it was so stressful. I cried a lot. I had so much PTSD in my body now that I look back on it, but I don't regret that decision of doing a residency, because again, it opened up my eyes to, like, I started teaching diabetes classes. I was going through integrative nutrition at the same time, and like healing my body, of looking at the deeper root of disease and why people get sick. And so this journey led me to where I am now. And I don't regret any single part of it, because it was so painful, but I turned that pain and alchemized it into why, like, the drive that I have now to help people.
Yeah, and is your sharing, and I really do appreciate your vulnerability in here. Is I think that many people listening, maybe will resonate with very specific parts of that, right? Whether it's an abuse part of a journey, or an eating disorder or some other trauma. But I think there's pieces and parts of all of us that can relate to some part of that story. And what's coming up for me is, like, where does that generative drive come from, right? So when you think about all that you've been through, when you think about, obviously the questions around, am I loved? And, then being abandoned. And when you talk about your residency journey, to me, when I think about, okay, you went through the scramble, and I'm sure in your father's eyes, now that was a kind of a dagger of like, okay, now you're choosing an option as the scramble, right? It's like the last resort, instead of this pathway that he had, seen you would take. And so my question is, where does that generative drive come from? Where do you attribute, you choosing to go down that path, right? So, I think in many abuse trauma situations, obviously I'm not a counselor in any way, shape, or form, but you tend to think that often you see people stuck in those situations because, it's harder to see the path out of it, and that becomes a new defined normal. And here, obviously, you talk about hitting that rock bottom in terms of, getting thrown out of the house, and, you choosing to go down this path anyways. And I almost felt, as you were sharing, almost like this tug down a undefined path. And I'm curious of, like, what is that pull? Like, what is that tug? What do you attribute to? Is that your faith? Is that I just had this intuition? Like, where does that come from?
I remember sitting on my bed one day meditating, because like I said, I had so much anxiety from living in this house where I knew, like, my parents pretty much hated me, and my brother. And like, I guess I laugh to kind of cope with it now, because I'm just like, I think back to how crazy it was. So please, like, if you're listening to this, please know I laugh at my own situation, I guess, because I'm just like, it was so crazy. But, I remember sitting and meditating at that time, because I was just trying anything to cope with this anxiety. And I felt this, and I heard this voice so clearly say, like, you need to get out of here. Like
Mm.
you need to leave. And so I guess I feel like that was really the first time that I felt that intuitive presence of
Mm-hmm.
God.
Mm.
Like, I grew up Catholic. I kind of had a little bit of connection, but it wasn't like
Mm-hmm.
my dad was not a pastor, or like I didn't really have that strong influence. But in those quiet moments when I was with myself, my intuition started to speak,
Mm-hmm.
because, there's so many fear influences that we have even now
Yeah.
with the news, people, like, expectations, parents, da 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 da. So when you quiet that voice and you really tune in, I started asking myself, like, what do I really want? And it was very scary, but
Mm-hmm.
it was that same feeling that I had back at the pharmacy. It was just this, it came from within, and it was just
Yeah.
this burst of energy that I knew it was like, without a shadow of a doubt, I need to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just, I think, too, probably the pain, like, think about when someone has to make a decision, the pain was so bad
Mm-hmm.
that I felt like I had to move. So like,
Yeah.
if you're in a bad relationship or a bad situation, eventually you get whittled down enough
Mm-hmm.
that it's like, I'm done.
Yeah.
That, like, F it moment.
Yeah.
So
And Christina, as you share, you talked about several things like, obviously your need for acceptance and to be loved. You talked about your nervous system activation. You talked about, your awareness of how emotions are being suppressed. You also talked about kind of the journey of not condoning in any way or, accepting in any way the abuse, but understanding and having a perspective on that as you now look back, which all of those together tell me you've been through a journey of inner work, of counseling, of I if you wouldn't mind just sharing for a moment what that journey has looked like for you, because I think for some, that
yeah.
are listening that say, oh, I've got a part of my story, that maybe I need to dig a little bit deeper despite the pain, right? That can be
Hmm.
there. And I just think the more that we can hear from others and on some level, normalize the work that needs to be done,
Yep.
the healthier we can all be. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of your journey of processing some of the emotion and the pain that you went through.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still a work in progress. Like, I'm doing specifically nervous system work right now, but I had started off with traditional therapists,
Mm-hmm.
and that only got me so far. When I started doing the subconscious work and I had hypnosis sessions, my anxiety went from like an 8 to a 2. And I started to say, okay, like, this is part of the breadcrumb trail of how I want to be helping people. So now that's what I do.
Mm-hmm.
All of these tools that I've learned throughout the years, I now help people with. And
Mm-hmm.
someone, I was working at a retreat one time, and somebody came up to me. They're like, you should call it like rapid transformation, because people shift so quickly,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm so intuitive and I've developed that muscle so much within myself. I can look at someone and say, okay, and coach them and ask them these questions that are going to draw out of them what needs to be shifted, because it's all internal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's the layers. I call it multidimensional healing. It's the nervous system that's holding the cellular memory of the
Yeah.
trauma. It's the patterns that you've come to cope with that trauma, people
Mm-hmm.
pleasing, perfectionism, overthinking. That's all a nervous system response. So it's the nervous system, all these patterns, and then there's typically core wounds that are there, like
Yeah.
unworthiness, shame.
Mm-hmm.
And so that needs to be digested in order to allow that flow of emotion, because, I grew up in a very suppressive environment,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't allow for you to tap into who you really are, the creativity, the gifts. And that's why I bring this work into
Mm-hmm.
helping entrepreneurs, because if you're suppressed, you're not going to show up fully self-expressed when you give a talk, when you go to put your message out there. This work is so much of, the inner work, but also the practical strategy
Yeah.
of, how do I bring all of who I am to the table when
Mm-hmm.
I am speaking, so that
Yeah.
I show up with power, conviction. And that's how you influence people, because then they know you care, they
Mm-hmm.
see the passion that you have, and that's how you start to create a domino effect of healing in the world, which is really why I believe I'm here. Is at the root cause. It's to be a beacon of light for other people. And that's why I'm so vulnerable in my story. I'm like, there's nothing, look in the crevices in the closet. There's nothing in my closet. Like, I will show you my closet because I want people to know that they're not alone. And I want them to know there are tools out there that can help them.
Yeah, I love how you described it as, multidimensional and the layers. That's been my own experience of just kind of slowly peeling back, the onion and the layers. And I think as you do that, and I'm convinced it's a lifelong journey. I don't think the work ever ends.
Yeah.
But through that, you start to get a little bit closer, a little bit closer, a little bit closer to who your authentic self is, right? And that is the unique advantage of every one of us. There is one Christina, there is one Tim, there's one of whoever's listening, and we've got an opportunity to really identify who is that, and how can we help serve others. So with that in mind, let's shift to talking more about your journey as an entrepreneur. And one of the things you share on your website is that you, quote, empower others to transform their lives, reveal their inner radiance, and step into more energy, confidence, and power. So what is the how behind that why? So how do you help people on that journey?
So it's part of what we just talked about. So it's that inner work, but it's also the practical strategy of, and I know we're going to talk about goal setting. So I'll bring this up now. So structured flexibility, right? So like if you think of a container, you need to have structure around something to hold the energy of it. So like if I were to just say, I want to have a business, but there's no structure or offer or clear place for somebody to land, then it's kind of like having a leaky bucket.
Yeah.
So I look at, okay, let's look at some of these patterns that you have that we can start shifting, as well as those practical strategies of how do we translate your gifts into gold. That's one of my signature methodology is turn your gifts to gold, because again, I always show this is like my new thing. I know that everybody listening, I'll describe what I'm holding up right now. So it is a diamond. And if you are following me on social media, you'll see that I post about this. This is on my Instagram. This is who we are. Like, I'm pregnant right now. I'm 21 weeks pregnant. This child is going to come out pure, get with all the gifts that it was born with it being brilliant, worthy, everything. It's pristine. But then what happens is over time, we learn that life isn't safe, right? In some way, whether it's a trauma or we get yelled at or punished or whatever that might be. And little kids make meaning out of things.
Yeah.
I'm bad, I'm unworthy, all of this. And so that's what we're carrying into our business. And people, it's so unconscious that's why we bring it to the conscious forefront and say, hey, this is what's showing up. So we can help you reveal more of that diamond, of the brilliance of who you came here to be, because you're most magnetic when you shine that light. And when you can help those people who are in your audience scrolling on Facebook, looking for the answers, that to me is true fulfillment.
Yeah.
So the more that you can reveal that and have these containers, and by containers, I mean like offers or the way that you tell your story in a way that's compelling and draws people to you, that's how you build a sustainable business. That's my belief. It's one perspective, but
and I know you work with a lot of entrepreneurs, but for everyone listening, like this work spans everyone, right? So obviously we're talking about it here in the framework of, being able to approach your business and how you serve others, and making sure that, what is unconscious becomes conscious, and we're aware of how that might be limiting what we're doing or holding us back. But, for someone who's at the front lines at a community pharmacy, or they're a manager or an administrator at a hospital, like, this work matters for everyone. It matters in your professional life. It matters in your personal life, and you're talking about some of the variables that as, kids growing up, we experience these things. Some of them might be traumatic enough that we remember, but often they're not. And I know that as a parent, like, there are micro moments. I had one of them with my kids last night where, after there's an interaction, it's like, ooh, like, how was that perceived? How could that have been done differently? And now mistakes are going to be made. That's a part of life. But how do I learn from that? And how can I talk that out loud and process that with them as well? And they need to hear me out loud say, like, I am sorry, I shouldn't have done X, Y, or Z, and I could
Yep.
have done this differently. And they need to hear those things. And I don't get it right a lot of the time, but this work matters as an employee, as an entrepreneur, as a parent, as a spouse, as a, father, mother, brothers. It matters in every relationship, that we
Right.
have. And so I just love the vision of what you're sharing. One of the things you have on your website, which really connected with me, is you said, quote, when we reconnect back to our true essence and remember who we really are, we are limitless, empowered, and we're free.
Yep.
So powerful, right? And that transcends so much of what we experience every day if we're able to get there.
And I want to just really quickly talk about that, because you hit on a really important point there with, when we have to cope with what's not resolved within us, then it turns into, like, for me, it was, drinking and numbing my emotions and staying busy and all of these
Yes.
coping mechanisms that disconnected me from myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so this process for me has been reconnecting back to my body, which, like, again, it's uncomfortable. If you've
It's
experienced
uncomfortable.
trauma, it's
Mm-hmm.
so uncomfortable sometimes to go into that pain. And so oftentimes people dissociate.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, how do I escape this? Like, can I just run away from this in any way possible? Vacations, whatever that coping mechanism is. But when you heal, that's when you're truly free. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what a lot of people are seeking, is through those mechanisms. It's
Yeah.
like, I just want to feel better.
That's
So,
right. That's right. Yeah. And I think I'll speak to this for a moment just because this has been my own journey. I know when I was doing some of the work that I'm doing now, one of my initial knee-jerk reactions was like, I had a great childhood. Like there is no trauma there. And,
right,
number one, all of us have experienced something. The magnitude of it, the significance of it could be different. But we all have our own journey. And, I think sometimes that we can confuse things like, I was provided for effectively, my parents helped and supported me, but there could be emotional gaps there. There could be
right,
emotional gaps in, how things were communicated or not communicated. And this is not about, digging up things that's going to lead to, judgment and, disgruntledness towards others. Right. I think part of
right,
this
right,
journey is to really have peace with that. But, so much of that, the more, to your point, the more that we can help move from being unconscious to conscious, once we're aware of it, and once we can tap into our emotions and start to slow down and say, okay, in this moment, I'm noticing myself feeling angry, I'm feeling fear, I'm feeling shame, I'm feeling guilt, whatever it be. And then connecting that with whatever interaction we're having. I know what I often realize is, whoa, like the emotional reaction, as real as it is way out of whack with the reality of the situation. Okay, where's that coming from? Like,
right,
why am I feeling
right.
so much anxiety and fear over
Yep.
something that when I can just step back and kind of untether, myself and sort of observe, like, oh, Tim, that's interesting. Like your heart rate's increased rapidly. You have shortness of breath. Like you're becoming really tense. Like, what's all that about? What's behind that? And those are tools. Those are things that we can use every day in our interactions that we have with others.
Right. Exactly. And the brain loves context, right? So, like, the
Mm-hmm.
nervous system feels safe when we have some kind of context around, oh, okay, like this is what's happening.
Yes.
And you can use whatever tool to regulate and be with that part that
Yeah.
is probably a past part of you that's like, hey, I need support. Hey, I wasn't supported in this way, or whatever it might be. So, yeah.
So one of the things I've shared before on this show is, and with others as well, is that I feel like parenting and entrepreneurship for me have exposed so many areas of weakness or opportunities for growth, however we want to say it.
Yeah.
And so many opportunities for self-reflection that I'm not sure, would have been there to the same degree without it, right? When you're talking about young kids, when you're talking about business, there are things that stretch, challenge, get out of your control in a way. Like for me, I was very good at like keeping things in a box and being able to kind of control and maneuver around it so that I didn't have to experience the uncomfortable feelings and the things. Well, guess what? When kids come to the equation, when business comes to the equation, like that box gets blown up sometimes. And it really, like for me, exposed like, oh, wow. Like when I don't have control of a situation, like that's where I see, a lot of things go awry. And that's an interesting discovery. Like, well, what's behind that? And why is that there? So my question for you is, as you think about your journey in business so far and soon to be as a parent, like, what have you learned about yourself? What has been the most significant one or two things that you've learned about yourself through not only your own journey of healing, but also through building and growing a business?
Oh my goodness. When I think of this analogy, when you have a business and you're growing it, it's like a mirror. Everything that needs to come up
That's
through
good.
client interactions, team interactions is going to come up. Like you said,
Mhm.
I love that analogy. You're like the box blows up because it's like you can't hide.
No.
You're facing off with yourself. And yeah, I would agree 100% with the control. Like for me, unworthiness came up,
Mhm.
control, people pleasing, all of those protective parts that just wanted to keep, like as a child, I just wanted to be safe.
Mhm.
And I never felt safe in my house because it was so chaotic. There was a lot of abuse going on. And so I learned to shut down. And that was part of my
Mhm.
coping mechanism, like I said. And I think through control, and my dad was both my parents were very controlling. That's what helped me feel like, oh, I have some sort of safety,
Yeah.
right? So it was kind of that dynamic that still plays out. And I'm
Mhm.
like, I have to catch myself. And I'm like, okay. And I, again, like that's one of the layers for me that I have to continually work on. And
Mhm.
that's why I have continuous support coaches, different
Yeah.
people that I hire, because I'm like, hey, I need to be witnessed in this. I need to be
Mhm.
held in this very uncomfortable situation. And but at the same time, like even currently, like in the past few months, I've had some situations where it really stretched me, and I've never
Mhm.
experienced this before. But from a higher perspective, I always come back to, okay, what is God trying to teach me through this? Because my character is being strengthened through this.
Mhm.
And so I feel the emotion, but then I also say, okay, what am I actually learning here? And that to me is
Yeah.
important for the integration process of
Yeah.
like, I'm not just going through this to feel pain. I'm actually alchemizing something within myself from a past version or whatever it is
Yes.
that's helping me become a higher version of myself,
Mhm. Yeah. And I think that integration part of the journey is so important, right? There's obviously the feeling of the emotions and, being more aware of that and how is that impacting, the relationships and things that are happening each and every day. But then what's the integration? And sometimes that's not a in the moment thing, at least speaking for myself. Sometimes that's, really leaning into the curiosity, as I've alluded to a couple different times.
Yeah.
And then through that curiosity and through that self-awareness and through kind of untethering yourself in that experience, it's okay, what is the integration part of this and what is there to be learned and how can I grow?
Mm-hmm.
I think the how can I grow is a good transition and segue into setting big goals. We're getting ready to come up on the new year, which is a time that people often look at the mirror and say, "Hey, what are some things that I want to focus on? What has been the year that's about to end? What do we want to shift and how do we want to grow into the new year?" And before we talk about some of the strategy and X's and O's for how you approach goal setting or how you approach this with your clients as well, I want to get just your general thoughts and recommendations on how you might help someone or encourage them to get in the right mindset before they get into the goal setting, right? The work before the work, if you will. Because I
Yep.
think so much of the goal setting exercise, I say this about the financial plan where we can work on X's and O's, we can develop a retirement plan, we can develop a debt repayment, we can do all these things. But if we're not in the right mindset around like why do we care about this topic of money, what's the goal, what's our relationship with money, all of these bigger types of things, those X's and O's are only going to go so far. So
Right.
I think similarly here on the goal setting, there's this important step of getting in the right mindset under which we're then thinking about how we set goals. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think getting in the right nervous system state is even a deeper level because when we're
Mm,
in fight or flight, this prefrontal cortex is not active. So this is where our creative solutions come from, our strategic thinking, our critical thinking. And so I would always encourage, and this I do this across the board with all of my clients, align the energy first. So looking at your nervous system, doing some of those exercises, but also really moving from to what feels pleasure led, like moving from
hmm
the mind of like, oh, like how much money do I, or whatever. Ask your heart and move into the body and say, what would feel really exciting for me? And I'm actually going to say this out loud because I want to commit to this, even though I'm having a child next year. I saw somebody who he has a list. He's really, very ambitious in my audience. He's not a pharmacist, but he was committed to speaking to 100 audiences in 2023. And he's like at the bottom of the list. And I thought to myself, I want to do that. I want to commit, whether it's through a Facebook Live, whatever it is, Instagram, speaking opportunities.
Podcast,
I'm putting it out there. So I would love to have that as a goal. So that for me feels juicy, alive, pleasure led. Like, yes, this is an something about impact that I really want to move with. And so from that vision, then you can obviously go into the more like practical planning pieces of it. But also it's like that structured flexibility, like not being too rigid where it's like the gripping, but allowing that co-creative force of God, the universe, whatever you want to call it, like the surrender piece, because we can only control so much.
Yeah.
But when you embody that version of yourself, like tapping into the energy of this is what I want, this is who would I have to be to achieve that goal? Because there's usually an evolution or a next version of yourself, right? Maybe a higher version of yourself. What would that be? And feeling into that frequency. I recommend this to my clients too, just even for 5 minutes every single day, because according to quantum physics, we're always attracting based upon our thoughts and our electromagnetic signature from our heart.
Yeah.
So that's what we attract, what we constantly think about, what we're constantly feeling. So
yeah,
that's a whole other topic.
It's a good one. And there's a lot of good resources on there, for people that want to learn more about that as well. But I think, what you shared about the pleasure led really resonates with me, right? Because I think for a lot of pharmacists, I'll speak for myself, but I suspect many may feel the same as well. High achiever, tend to want to please others, want to develop these, goals that may have expectations tied to others, and really slowing down and getting out of our head, getting into our bodies to really take the space and time to say, does this resonate with me? Is this an expectation of someone else?
Right.
Is this really authentic to me or not? And that really requires, your point, getting in the right state of our nervous system. I've been in these exercises with my small group of men where we meet once a week for 2 hours, and we kick off our meeting typically with one of the men leading a 15-20 minute type of meditation exercise. Yep. And I can consistently now almost have gotten to the point where I will show up and it feels like there's an uneven distribution of weight of my head to my body, because I've been throughout the day, I'm just programmed like through, repetition, experience, whatever, that if I'm not careful and I don't slow down, like I will live so much of the day in my head that I can actually feel like the physical exhaustion of that in my head. And really to be able to slow down and like get into my body. And typically by the end of that meeting, like I can actually feel like the shift of the stress and the weight in my body. And I've actually described it to the guys in my group that like, it feels like if I close my eyes, sometimes it feels like my head is like in a giant space, like disproportionately weighted to the rest of my body. But it's just such a good reminder of like slowing down, like what are the exercises, what are the habits, what are the behaviors can really get ourselves into checking in with our body. And I think aligning that with goal setting is so important, right? Because I think if we're not careful, like, are these your goals? Are these someone else's goals? And even if they're your own derived goals, maybe not at an expectation of others, does it actually resonate with you? Right. So you gave that example, which I think is a really good one, because someone else might see that and say, oh, I want to do that too, but not because it really resonates, but because they're like, oh, that would be cool to speak 100 times. Like that would be cool, right? There could be some pride there. There could be some ego there.
Right.
But the way you described it is like that really resonated with you internally, right? For whatever reason. I think it comes full circle to where you started your story, which was, early in your life, identifying that you really have a desire to want to help other people, right? That to me ties very directly to that. So I think getting in the right state of mind, getting out of our head, making sure that it's a pleasure-led process is so important. Now, I want to get a little bit more detail from you on this concept of structured flexibility, because this has been my experience where I've gone through goal setting in many different formats. And sometimes I come up with these very comprehensive, plans that seem great. You get the dopamine rush. And then 2 weeks in, you're like, oh my gosh, this is exhausting. What was I thinking? I'm going in 12 directions. I've got every domain of wellness, defined with 5 different sub goals. And then I've been on the other end where it's too loose. It's maybe not motivating enough or not structured enough. And I do think there's a middle ground here, which I believe is what you're referring to, the structured flexibility. So tell us more about what that looks like for you.
Yeah, I'll just even give a concrete example of a launch. Like I just did a pivot to profit 3-day, it's a client converting workshop. Like I bring everybody in, I teach them, it's like a really detailed PDF. And I'm like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this 3-day event, deliver tons of value. And then I'm going to share about one of my programs. As I'm going through the launch, I'm like, oh, I want to do a trick or treat giveaway. So that came in, like being open to the downloads that come through. Like I call them downloads. It's like that divine kind of intuition. And so I added that in, and maybe I took something out. It's kind of like cooking. It's like, oh, do I like my food spicy? All right, maybe I won't add so much of this, but I'll add this. So I think it's being a little bit flexible with, number one, like those components, but also not being so rigid of like, I need 5 clients from this launch. Like it for me, it comes back to, and you talked about that word ego. I really try, and it's a constant thing. I'm like, okay, I'm releasing. I know that this is my ego talking right now. That's wanting this outcome. I'm going to let that go, and I'm going to open up to whatever the highest outcome is going to be. And I'm going to show up and serve and give 110% and do this plan, be flexible, implement those downloads, like I said, but also having that openness of, I wonder what else could show up, that it doesn't have to be so rigid. You know what I mean?
No, that makes sense. And I think that very concrete example you just gave, related to the launch is a good one, right? Because I think so often, not only can we adopt other people's goals, but we can set a goal. And then speaking for myself, I'm so structured and rigid to that goal that I lose any of the openness and flexibility to, okay, might there be a different idea, a different pathway, or even feedback from audience or, different things that are coming in that says, okay, am I flexible enough to be able to pivot and move in real time? And usually if I develop a plan, it's like, this is the plan, right? We're going with it. And I'm going to see, which there's value in that, and there's real value that can come from kind of that, stick to itiveness and wanting to see it through and being resilient, but also adding some flexibility to that.
I'm laughing because I'm thinking like, that's how I'm like, oh, like I'm going to plan with this baby. And like, we're going to get the food all ready. And I'm like, I'm sure like my whatever is going to blow up my plan, but that's okay.
Well, this has been fantastic. And I'm so grateful for your contributions to our community, your vulnerability and sharing your story. I think many are going to find that inspiring, insightful, and maybe on some level motivating to do some more self-discovery in their journey. Also appreciate your feedback that you gave on, how we can be thinking about setting goals and sharing about your entrepreneur journey. Where is the best place that our listeners can go, Christina, to learn more about your work and to follow your journey along the way as well?
Yeah. So my website is pharmacistcoach.com. And then from there, you'll find all of my social media handles, my group, Monetize Your Magic. Everything, like my Instagram is at the Pharmacist Coach. So I would love to connect and feel free. Like I literally am an open door. So if you want to share, hey, I loved what you said in the episode, or if you have questions, please reach out. I'm happy to support.
Awesome. Well, we will connect in the show notes to social media, to the website, pharmacistcoach.com, as well as to your email, Christina@pharmacistcoach.com, if people want to reach out directly. So Christina, thank you so much for coming on the show, and wishing you an awesome 2024. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements, which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.